This week on the Hollywood in Toto podcast, I explain my obsession with the whole rise of anti-Semitism and how it actually connects to Hollywood. I talk with the brave and talented Jennifer Sey, and I don't use those words loosely, about her new movie, Generation COVID. She refused to follow the pandemic narrative, and she paid a price for it. And I recommend an older show about life as a stand-up comedian, and boy, it is not glamorous, not at all.
Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast. Entertainment news and reviews without the woke Hollywood narrative. Free speech, free expression. Now that's entertainment. And here's your host, award-winning film critic, Christian Toto.
Before we start, I'd love it if you subscribe to the Hollywood in Toto podcast. Got new episodes every Wednesday, plus more and more bonus episodes coming in hot. I admit, I can't stop talking about Hamas and anti-Semitism. I can't stop hearing podcasts that explore the issue. Can't stop. Now, I'm a movie guy. I'm not a political reporter. And when it comes to global conflicts, it's not my area of expertise at all. I would much rather be talking about things like the Marvels. I'd like to speak to your manager. Yeah, I stole that line from John Nolte of Breitbart News, but it makes me smile every time I say it and think about it. So I just wanted to say it again right here. But these topics that I'm talking about, Hamas, Israel, the Middle East conflict, they do overlap with pop culture in some pretty important ways. Let's start with Patricia Heaton. Everybody loves Patricia Heaton, right? Wink, wink. You know, I met her on the movie set a few years ago. It was called Mom's Night Out. And she had to shoot a specific scene in which she falls. And of course, she shot the moment, and then she did it again and again and again. And I guess the director wanted a certain look, a certain angle. Who knows what a director wants in any given moment, but you know, you have to get it just right. That's movie making. Heaton was a trooper. I mean, she's not a young person anymore, and it was a bit physical for sure. And she just kept doing it again and again. No comments, no diva behavior. She was a professional. And, you know, she was the biggest star on the set at the time, so she could have pulled a "do you know who I am" routine, or, I don't know, just something. Nope. Just kept hitting her marks again and again until the director got the moment that he wanted. And I like seeing something like that, and I wasn't surprised. And I think when you watch her on screen, she's got moxie. She's got something about her, an energy. She's a trooper, like I said. Now, you know, what Heaton is obsessed with these days is what I'm obsessed with. Again, Hamas and anti-Semitism on the rise. And she shared exactly why she's obsessed, why she can't stop talking about it in a recent post on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. I want to read part of what she wrote. She says she is alarmed at the horror Hamas perpetrated on innocent people, alarmed at the biased anti-Israel tone of so many media outlets, especially BBC News and Sky News, the very people whose country fought for the Nazis so violently. She's alarmed at the immediate and well-organized pro-Hamas protests that sprung up all over the West. She's alarmed at government organizations like the UN who are clearly anti-Semitic, alarmed at universities and students' embrace of terrorism and oppressive cultures, alarmed at citizens tearing down posters of innocent hostages, alarmed at so many seemingly nice, integrated people, especially in the medical field, revealing genocidal beliefs against the Jews. Alarmed at law enforcement officials not lifting a hand to stop public calls for violence and death to Jews. This goes on and on. And it's so right and so thoughtful and so interesting and so efficient. You know, a lot of times the beauty of writing is getting it done and getting it done quickly, making your point and moving on. That's the whole genesis of being a good writer. You don't want to bloviate. What she does is she really nails the issue. But I also want to mention one more thing that she said in that particular post. She says she's alarmed at the silence of supposedly feminist groups who refuse to condemn Hamas raping women. And she's alarmed at the silence from so many in Hollywood who are normally so quick to jump on any social bandwagon. Ah, that one left a mark for sure, especially within her industry. I'm sure she's well liked. Now, another celebrity speaking out is Julianna Margulies. And I think a lot of people got to know her on ER. She was in love with George Clooney's character back in the day, and now she's on The Morning Show, which I loved for 2 seasons, and boy, did it jump the shark in season 3. It got woke, it got preachy, I just bailed on it. But she's out with a new op-ed. It was in USA Today just a few days ago. And she's talking about being a Jewish person, about wanting people who aren't Jewish to understand what Jewish people are going through right now. It really is a powerful essay. And kudos to her. Kudos to USA Today for publishing it. Except this part of the op-ed, it stopped me in my tracks. By your inaction to reach out, I immediately thought about the Jews of the Holocaust and what that must have felt like when no one spoke out or stood up to protect them. Perhaps that's why I jump at the chance to march in Black Lives Matter protests, rally everyone I know to fight for LGBTQ plus rights, and sound the siren when I hear that immigrant children are being held in cages. All right, let's put the kids in cages line aside, because all the activism and all the outrage about that disappeared when a Democrat was in the Oval Office. So let's shelve that. She just gave a shout out to Black Lives Matter, or BLM. That's the same BLM that celebrated what Hamas did on October 7th. The same one. So when I read that paragraph, I got angry. And then I tried to take a beat, because that's what you should do. Let's get rid of the hot takes. Let's think about things. Not just going to go off on a rant. Is it possible that Julianna Margulies, big-time star, doesn't know that multiple BLM chapters celebrated the massacre we're talking about? I think it's possible. And to check it out, I did a Google News search. I searched BLM and I searched Hamas, those 2 phrases back to back. And I got a bunch of right-leaning news sites that covered the story. And I guess most notably was the Chicago branch of the BLM. They celebrated the paraglider image that Hamas used to kill all those people at that music festival as part of that outrageous October 7th attack. Now, there were a couple of mainstream-ish outlets that also talked about the BLM connection to Hamas. Pretty minor stuff, but it wasn't CNN, it wasn't the New York Times, it wasn't the Washington Post, or any other of the major players on the scene or other major newspapers across the country. And I think that's why Julianna Margulies didn't even realize the awful, no good, terrible error in her otherwise wonderful op-ed. And then I thought, well, who else didn't know about this? What about the editors at USA Today? I mean, they just didn't publish this without reading it. Did any of those editors understand the context here? Did any of them reach out to Margulies and say, listen, hey, we love the op-ed, we're going to run it. One thing, you know about BLM and how they honor the atrocities that took place that day, right? I mean, do you want to maybe rethink that sentence or maybe just take it out entirely? Well, it didn't happen. So either the editors just were too embarrassed to share what she said and the context of it, or they didn't know either. It's just amazing. And to me, the biggest question left is, if those editors knew about what BLM said about the attacks, would they even raise the issue with the actress and ask her to change it? Any way you look at it, the mind reels. Tinseltown loves to throw the word brave around. She's brave to gain 20 pounds for a film role. He's brave to speak his truth from the Oscar podium. Ugh. You want bravery? Check out Jennifer Sey. Jennifer is a former gymnast and someone who rose up the corporate ranks at Levi's, the pants company. And she was this close to becoming the company's first female CEO, which would have been pretty cool. And then she started opening her yap. What did she say? Well, she talked about COVID-19 and the pandemic and the lockdowns. And much more specifically, why maybe lockdowns aren't a good idea. And it's a terrible idea to close schools down and kick kids out and make them take virtual classes and mask them up. Kids are at the least amount of danger from this particular virus. The ramifications of this could be profound. Of course, she was right about everything here. Everything. At the time, though, you weren't allowed to say these things out loud, not in polite company. And, of course, Levi's, well, did they respect her free speech rights? Did they say, hey, we agree to disagree? No. They forced her to quit before she could become the first female CEO. She even wrote a book about this entire situation, which is brilliantly titled, Levi's unbuttoned. The woke mob took my job, but gave me my voice. You know, I don't want to quibble with Jennifer, but I think she's always had a voice. But now she's got her mind set on a different project. It's a documentary that looks back at the terrible decisions that were made during the pandemic. Here's what she said about Generation COVID on her Substack account. It is now undeniably clear children have paid the heaviest price for the lockdowns, especially the most disadvantaged and vulnerable children. Our kids are not all right. Yeah, she's right. It's terrible. It's tragic. That's why I can't wait to see her new film, Generation COVID. And of course, I couldn't wait to invite her on the Hitcast to share more about the project and her remarkable story. Jennifer, thanks for joining the show. Now, you've been a competitive athlete, an author. You were this close to being a CEO, obviously. And now you're a filmmaker. I'm curious about that transition and what's been the most either satisfying or most intriguing part of that shift.
Well, that's a great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that. I think I do the things that I love and that I feel passionate about, and it just has taken me on that journey. I loved gymnastics as a child, until it got to be too much because the training culture is very abusive. But I mean, I loved it and I wanted to do it all the time. And I made the national team, and I was on the national team for 7 years and the national champion in '86. When I moved on, I moved on. I went off to college and then ended up in the corporate world and worked my way up the ladder, became the brand president at Levi's, working for a brand that I just loved. I don't think I could have done it at just any company, but I really loved Levi's and had worn them since a child. And along the way, I took on other projects. I have written 2 books and made a film. One of the I have made one film and I'm making another. The first book and the first film I did while I was working at Levi's. And again, I just pursued them as passion projects. So I think that's probably the thread that ties it all together. And I'm just not afraid to start things that I don't know how to do and figure it out as I go.
Gotcha. The Generation COVID is looking at children impacted by mandates, lockdowns. We've all lived through that experience. Is there a way to sum up the impact that this has all had on children? I know there are multi-levels.
Yeah.
There's reading comprehension. There's, emotional health. There's so much happening. But what's a broad statement to say about how this has impacted kids? Because I think it needs to be focused on, it needs to be said, because I don't think we're talking about it enough.
Yeah, I would agree with you entirely. And that's why I'm making this documentary called Generation COVID. I think the summary is that the kids are not all right. This generation has suffered enormously and there's nothing being done to get them back on track, whether it's learning loss, severe mental health impacts like weight gain and obesity, lost opportunity, not graduating, not playing sports, not getting that college scholarship. These things add up and they have severe, very significant generational impact. Even if it's only 10% of the kids, even if it's only 5%, that is a dramatic impact. And we know at this point, the kids are struggling in school. Chronic absenteeism is as high as it's ever been. I think it's way higher than it's ever been. So that means those kids are not going to graduate. This is a generational problem, and it's a problem for us all, not just this generation. Because if the kids are not okay and they're not functioning in society and able to hold jobs, the entire society will suffer for that.
In recent months, we've read articles in mainstream news outlets that have touched on some of the things you just mentioned. A little bit here, a study there. I don't think it's been comprehensive, and I certainly don't think that reporters have held people accountable for their actions, for actions that were very predictable, and the results were very predictable. Is it fair to say that one of the reasons why you're making this movie is because of that inability of the media not doing its job as fully as it should?
100%. That's absolutely the reason. I think we sort of broad strokes, we all read an article from time to time in the newspaper about the learning loss or the very high absenteeism. I think I just read one in Washington, D.C., something like 2/3 of the high schoolers are chronically absent. That means absent more than 10% of the time. And so there's sort of acknowledgement, but there is no accountability. There is no assessment of what happened, who did it, because these were policy choices that government and public health leaders made. how we're going to help these kids get back on track, and how we're going to ensure that it never happens again. And I believe there needs to be a comprehensive assessment. There needs to be stories told. We need to hear from the children themselves, because that is what breaks through and moves people to action. You know, they don't want to read a long paper with statistics in it. They're moved by stories. And I think when people hear from these kids themselves, they will be moved. And I just believe in the power of film and of art to move people, move hearts and minds. I made a film called Athlete A about abuse in the Olympic movement. And it started a movement among athletes, young gymnasts in particular, and retired gymnasts demanding change in their sports. And only then did change start to happen.
Well, you're right about pop culture and how it does move the needle in ways that, you know, like you said, a lot of the facts and figures often can't get done. This is a very cynical thought, and maybe you're sharing my cynicism. I believe if we saw a spike in the next few weeks and all of a sudden COVID was back to a certain degree, I think a lot of these protocols would just snap back into place, the ones that you're skewering in this film. Do you share my cynicism there?
I 100% agree with you, because there has been no sort of, like I said, accountability. There has been no line in the sand to say, not only was this ineffective, but it was incredibly harmful and therefore can never happen again. So they will slide right back into it. And, you know, for those who are strong believers in lockdowns and school closures, they will still say these harms were caused because of COVID, not because of COVID policies. And the fact is, it was the policies themselves, not the virus.
You've been on top of this issue for a while now, and obviously the film is an outflowing of that effort. But when you enter a project, you have an idea, you've got a narrative, you've got things you want to share, but then you do your digging, you find more information, you talk to the kids themselves, you get them on camera. What did that open up to you about this subject? What did you learn that was maybe even more shocking or even more surprising than what you initially feared about the subject?
Well, two things. I started out envisioning a very different concept. I was going to compare California to Florida and how the children fared in these states. They're very different in terms of their COVID policy, right? Mm-hmm. California is the state that closed schools the longest. It was close to 19 months. Florida wasn't the shortest. There were some states that were shorter, but they were very much in the news because essentially, the governor, Ron DeSantis, demanded that the schools all open in the fall of 2020. And ultimately they did. There were some legal battles, et cetera, but they did all open. So my intent was to compare those two states. But as I did my digging and my research, what I learned was all the kids were struggling, even in Florida, where yes, schools opened sooner and the learning losses, and it's great, but there were ongoing restrictions in the schools for another year and a half, and that impacted their ability to learn. And so then I just wanted to go out and talk to kids in other states, and it really is catastrophic when you look at it across the states. We went to urban areas in California, we went to New York City, we went to suburbs in Connecticut. We went to a farming community in Colorado. So we really tried to represent, the broad geography that is this country. And, across the board, I would say the kids are struggling. And that was a little different than what I thought. And we sort of changed direction based on that. That's the first thing. The second thing I learned was the kids that even if they struggled, that sort of were able to pull themselves out of it, were kids that had kind of a third-party mentor that wasn't a parent. They had a coach that was helping them kind of navigate things. They had a tutor. They had, there's an organization in Greeley, Colorado called Zero Dropouts, and they were very persistent in getting kids to come back to school who had in fact dropped out, large immigrant community. Kids that didn't have that were lost. And in fact, many of them have been lost to the system. But, the last thing I will add, which I think is obvious and has been in the headlines somewhat, is the most vulnerable children were harmed the most. So low-income kids living in poverty, kids who, perhaps don't have two parents at home or, are living in a single parent home and that parent works nights and they sleep during the day, kids who are left home to take care of 3, 4, 5 younger siblings, kids left home with an abuser. These are the kids that have been set back the farthest, that really struggled the most. But even the middle income and higher income children weren't protected from the isolation and the loneliness. And that's where we see really severe mental health impacts as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely heartbreaking. One of the things that's so maddening about this whole topic is that it became deeply political in a way that it shouldn't, because it should be about health, about science, about, liberty versus restrictions. There
Right.
were all these conversations that really shouldn't be left or right, but it seemed to become a left-right issue almost
Yeah.
to the core. Can you, as a filmmaker, you're telling the story, do you avoid that subject? Do you weave it into the narrative? How do you approach it? Because that could be something where someone says, well, gosh, I'm a progressive gal or guy. I don't want to watch this movie because it seems like a conservative hit piece. How do you work around that, or how do you maybe even just process that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we don't want the film to be political, but it's almost inevitable because this issue was politicized and very polarized in the world in general, when it should have just been about the children. Why it got politicized, I don't know if it's because there was an election in 2020. Sort of, I think that sort of prompted a lot of it. I think Trump derangement syndrome, if we want to call it that, as shorthand, and just sort of pushing back on anything he said we needed to do. And in the summer of 2020, he said schools needed to open. And suddenly, the American Academy of Pediatrics reversed their recommendation to open them from 2 weeks earlier to oppose him, I think. So it's kind of impossible to avoid the politics. But here's what I'll say. This film is for everyone. Every family in the film and almost every expert says at the beginning, they were all in. They were scared. They were afraid of COVID. They were afraid of becoming ill. They were afraid of their children becoming ill. But very soon after, in 2 months, 3 months, they started to experience the impacts and the harms, and they sort of changed their opinion. Here's the other point I'll make is I think more than half of the families, probably 3/4 of the families, are left. They are left-leaning, they are registered Democrats, or they were up until recently. And this actually dramatically changed their feelings about the party. So these are people that almost all of them come from the left. And when they challenged the closed schools policy in their community, whether it was Oakland, California, San Francisco, New York City, they faced tremendous pushback, and they were vilified as alt-right, people who had voted Democrat their entire life. So I think we will get at some of that polarizing politics by telling those stories.
Like you said, if you shared certain beliefs, you could be punished or censored or vilified. You've lived that story. When you think about making a movie now on this subject, it sort of magnifies that conversation by 100. Now, Every movie is hard to make. I've spoken to many filmmakers. It's always a struggle getting the money, getting everything falling into place is never easy. But along this path so far, have you found obstacles that were maybe unusual?
Yeah, it's been very difficult to raise money. The documentary film community is very left-leaning. I went to some more kind of traditional doc funding sources, people that had given money, for instance, on Athlete A, my first documentary, and they didn't want to be attached to a film like this, even if they agreed, and some of them did. So I went to non-traditional sources. I've just met folks here in moving to Denver that are part of, for instance, the school choice community. They were eager to get this story out there. There has been kind of a school choice explosion, I think, since COVID. So that community has been interested, but I put money in myself because I believe in the message and the story. But yeah, the funding piece has been challenging, and I'm sure the distribution piece will be as well, but we're going to keep pushing forward. And I really do think we're making a movie for everyone. That's what we are keeping in mind. Mm-hmm. If you were a strong advocate for keeping the schools closed, I just want you to hear from these kids and families and see what happened, and try to kind of re-examine your priors. I don't know how you can hear from these children and families and hear what they went through and not think a little bit differently about perhaps where you were in the past.
Building on what you just said, if a movie came out, it was a documentary, and it talked about children who are suffering and having their voices be heard, I would think that a Variety, maybe the Hollywood Reporter, would be all over it. They'd want to share your story, talk to you, talk to some of the people behind the scenes, get it out there. That I can safely predict will not happen. And I think any mainstream press will be antagonistic at best. So what's the plan B for you and your team as far as, I mean, obviously you're talking to me right now and I wish I had a bigger platform, but I'm doing what I can. How do you get the message out there over the next few months? Because that will be critical because people do need to be aware of this. And if they're not, then it defeats the purpose.
Yeah. I mean, I want a broad reach mainstream streamer. I think the minute you commit to a more niche audience and a more niche streamer, you're kind of preaching to the choir, as they say. And my goal, I'm happy to do that. I want to make an incredibly high quality film. I think if folks watch the trailer, they're going to see that it's a really high quality film with, super high production values, that kind of thing. But I'm targeting a mainstream streamer and I'm going to start pitching them. And I think once you have that sort of, if we get that kind of stamp of approval, then perhaps the mainstream press will be willing to cover it. I think if our distribution ends up being a more niche distributor, I'm not going to name who they might be, but sort of more conservative leaning, the mainstream press is going to be less likely, to report on it. But you have these really interesting options now, like Angel Studios, which I'm sure you've heard of, which is, their films are breaking through in the mainstream. So there's more options than there have been in the past, and we're open to all of them.
When you think about the media's coverage of this whole subject, what would you like to see differently? What should they have done over the last few months and even maybe a couple of years now that they didn't do? I mean, we talked about how there had been a story here, there's a story there. What's the, the journalistically sound approach that should have happened that didn't?
They needed to, I'm going to go beyond school closures to lockdowns more broadly and all COVID policies, including vaccine mandates and mask mandates and all of it. They did not interrogate the issue. They did not go in objectively. I have a special place in my heart, which is not positive, for the way journalists treated this issue. I think it was a dereliction of duty. They did not investigate and interrogate the issues. They didn't look at effectiveness. They didn't look at harms. They essentially printed government-issued talking points, big pharma press releases, as if they were journalism. And like I said, that's a dereliction of duty. So I find it, incredibly disappointing. And even now in the press, there's a little bit of the attitude. There was a piece that everybody talks about by Professor Emily Oster, I think in The Atlantic almost a year ago at this point, which was okay. Maybe, there were some mistakes made specifically around kids in schools, but, we need to grant amnesty because good people, perhaps made not the greatest decision, but they did it for the right reasons. And the subtext there is the bad people might have been right. I'm the bad people here, but they were right for the wrong reasons. So they don't deserve any grace. And I just reject that, and recently, I think it was a week or two ago on Bill Maher, Professor Scott Galloway essentially made the same type of comment. He said, I was for school closures, but I think people like me need to be treated with a little grace and forgiveness. Well, I don't know. I think those of us who were right and pushed out of our jobs and communities deserve a little more grace and forgiveness than those who were wrong. So forgive me if I don't really have any right now.
Yeah, and that's as far as we've gotten as far as the mea culpas go. That's been it. It's been very limited. Much more is necessary. If I may dial the story back just a little bit, you mentioned how many people, and I put myself in the same camp, believed the narrative, did what we were told, used the masks, 2 weeks to stop the spread. And then slowly we started to realize, hey, wait a minute, something's not right here. What was it for you? What were the elements that lined up early on where you thought, oh gosh, I don't think they're telling me the whole story and I'm suspicious of what's happening? What were those beats early in your awakening, for lack of a better phrase?
I never went along.
Okay.
I was just from no. Okay. I mean,
you were ahead of the. You and Adam Carolla were the people who knew it was going on right away.
Well, I mean, my husband and I, and we might have been the only people in San Francisco, were very suspicious from the beginning. I think there's two reasons why. One, there was very clear data that was available and ignored from the very beginning that this was a virus that, like 3,000-fold impacted the elderly. That data was available from that Diamond Princess cruise ship. It was available from Italy, which was, one of the places that was hit first. It was always available. So from my perspective, treating everybody as if they were at equal risk when they never were, was set off my alarm bells.
Yeah.
The second, we treated everyone as if you were sick until proven innocent. I also had looked up and kind of dusted off the CDC's pandemic playbook from, I don't know, I think it was 2006. And it was very clear that you never close schools, certainly not for longer than 4 or 6 weeks. So that made me very skeptical from the very beginning. And I think just beyond that, even if it was effective, which it wasn't, and it was harmful, and we were told to ignore the harms, I found it just such an egregious and grotesque violation of our civil liberties and of our individual rights. That to me alone was a moral atrocity from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So I think even if effective, I would have opposed it. People can make their own decisions.
I'm going to wrap this up with one question, but before I do, I don't want to forget this little element, and it's wildly anecdotal, but I take my kids to school every day, back and forth. And to this day, I still see the occasional child outdoors alone walking to school with a mask on. And my heart breaks because I just think about what else that person is going through, what their parents are telling them, what they believe in their hearts. I mean, if you're walking to school and you're alone, mom and dad, they're not there. They're not seeing you, but they're still wearing that mask. And it just kills me. And that's why your Generation COVID, your film, is so important. But I want to take a big picture sense of you, because it's so easy in life to do as we're told, to go with the flow, to kind of fight our instincts and say, okay, I'll do this at work. I understand, my boss is a jerk, but I'm going to just go with it because I want this job. You didn't do that. And you lost a significant job, and I'm sure a lot of income attached to it. But here you are, you're a survivor, obviously. You've got this movie coming soon. What can you share with people about that journey that maybe would nudge them in the direction you took? Because it's not easy. And I don't know if I could do it myself. It's very hard. You did it. You suffered, but you bounced back. But what would you say to people who may be facing something similar? And it could be on any topic, not just COVID, obviously.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and I faced similar blowback, although not kind of on the world stage, when I spoke out about the training environment in gymnastics. And, now everybody says, oh, yeah, we knew all along. But I'll tell you, in 2008, when I wrote my first book, the way that I was torn down and dragged across the internet was pretty scary then too, and was essentially ostracized from the community that I grew up in, just called a liar and a grifter and all of these things for saying very true things. And so I think, first of all, I go into these things sort of naively. I don't think of myself as like, I'm going to tear this thing down. I just start saying things that are true. And then when I'm told I can't, that's when my shackles go up. And I'm like, why can't I say a true thing? And people say to me all the time, why was this the hill you were willing to die on? Because you're right, I lost a lot. I had to leave my city. I lost a lot of friends, have fractured family relationships. And of course, I'm not in a job that I held at a company I was at for 23 years. But they asked me, why was this the hill you were willing to die on? And I look at them and I say, well, why weren't you? We're talking about the health of our nation's children and defending free speech. Those are mine. You may have different ones, or you may have none. And if you have none, then you need to take a good long look in the mirror.
Yeah.
So I don't know. For me, it's just, I can't imagine not, standing up for children. When I was a child and enduring an incredibly abusive training environment, and everybody knew about it, and no adult stood up and said enough. I wish someone had stood up for me, and they didn't. So I won't let that happen.
Gotcha. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining the show. The upcoming movie is Generation COVID, and you can support it right now. Just go to givesendgo.com and punch in Generation COVID in the search bar. It works. There's no blocking on this particular website. I know that happens with some other fun, crowdfunding campaigns. It won't happen here. You'll get it right to the page. Give if you can. We do need this story to be told. And a few people are better to do just that than you, Jennifer. So thank you for being the voice of so many people who have been hurt by COVID. And I just think that more and more people have to hear this story and hear it in the way that you're going to tell it. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are definitely living in the content overload age. I think it needs a better title. Maybe we'll send that up to the send it up to the team. Think if we can kind of maybe brainstorm on it, find out what we come out. We need like a catchy name for this moment. There's just so many shows out there, so many movies. It's impossible to watch them all. And the good news is, I don't know about you, but I feel no pressure to catch up on shows that start with The Real Housewives ... Just, I'll pass, thank you. But I do feel badly for missing a lot of shows that seem pretty interesting. Some got great reviews, some had interesting topics, just so much out there. We just don't have the time. And I'm lucky enough to subscribe to a lot of different platforms, so I have the access. It's just the bandwidth. I just can't do it. So I've been trying to catch up here and there, now and then. Again, some of these shows have been canceled or just went away a couple of years ago. In case in point, the HBO comedy, it's called Crashing. The show lasted 3 seasons, and you can see it now on Max. Remember that classic rebranding that HBO did? I don't dislike it, but it still is a lot of people scratching their heads. But the show follows a struggling stand-up comedian played by Pete Holmes, a real-life comedian, and he's trying to find his voice and some sort of career. Any kind, really. This guy is broke. Now, again, it's created by Holmes, who is starring, creating, writing, doing all the things behind the scenes. And I didn't know a lot about Pete Holmes, but I recently watched his Netflix special. It's fairly new, maybe a couple weeks old. Did love it. He's got a certain style I didn't think was hysterical, and I kind of gave up on about 20 minutes in. But I tell you, on Crashing, he is terrific. He's playing a Christian comedian who's trying to break in to stand up. And of course, that means all sorts of dehumanizing things you have to do to get attention, to get stage time, just to make yourself a possible break. And I mean possible. This is a brutal business. Now, on the show, his character gets a lot of help from comedians like TJ Miller and Sarah Silverman, the great Artie Lang. They are playing versions of themselves, give or take, and they're all great too. Funny stuff. It really is an intriguing look at being on, I guess you could say, the lowest rung of the show business ladder. Maybe a YouTube influencer just starting out as the official lowest rung. But boy, if you're a stand-up comedian with no gigs, no money, no cachet, no clout, no experience, that is rock bottom. But you know what? Sometimes the people who are at rock bottom are happy. They just want to try this game out. They want to see if they can make it as a stand-up comedian. Odds are almost impossible, of course, and certainly not everyone's going to be a Jerry Seinfeld or a Chris Rock. But they're out there, they're trying, and Crashing captures it. It's pretty funny, it's smart, it's certainly bittersweet. My gosh, this poor guy doesn't even have a home in the beginning of this series, and you can't help but root for this guy. It's very charming. If you ever thought about stand-up comedy and how scary it must be to be standing in front of people, strangers, and trying to make them laugh and bombing at the same time, imagine doing that at open mic nights where there's no one in the crowd, maybe 1 or 2 drunks, someone half asleep. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. No one cares, but you know what? You've got to go through with it. You've got to tell the jokes. You've got to get your reps on the stage because it's the only way to get better. And I love the fact that Crashing shows that for all it's worth, the good and the very, very bad. So if you're like me and you've missed the Crashing the first time, 3 seasons worth on Max right now, give it a try. Alrighty then, that's it for the show. I took a week off for the holidays. I don't plan to do so for Christmas. It will be full speed ahead. But of course, thank you to Radio America for having me as part of their great podcast lineup. I always want to give them a shout out. They've been so kind to me. And while I have your attention, please check out HollywoodInToto.com. It is updated 7 days a week. You've got news and commentary, interviews, all about what's going on in Hollywood. And by the way, 2024 is almost here. It will be the 10-year anniversary of the website. Yes, I'm old. The website isn't quite as old as I am, but boy, time marches on, and I hope you check it out when you can. And of course, like this show, HollywoodandToto.com is the right take on entertainment. Hope you all had a great Thanksgiving break, and I will see you next time.
It's important to properly dispose of unwanted medication or sharps. MedProject offers free and convenient disposal options near you. To learn more, call 844-MED-PROJECT or visit medproject.org.
Okay, round two. Name something that's not boring.
A laundry? Ooh, a book club. Computer solitaire, huh?
Ah, sorry, we were looking for Chumba Casino. That's right. ChumbaCasino.com has over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+ terms and conditions apply. See website for details.